we could get already been meeting, and I understand that the HRA may be meeting after this meeting, and so if we keep things moving along, it'll be good. So I'm president of the Port Authority. I'll call the Port Authority meeting order, but let me just say before that, I was looking around the table. It is so wonderful to see the diversity of people that we have sitting here. It's just great. So with that, the Port Authority's call to order.
All right, and I'm calling to order the HRA meeting.
Okay, well, we have,
Introductions are on the table.
yeah, I think that's a good idea. Okay. You want to start?
Sure, I will. I'll wait, pass over here. Let's start our guest. Oh, great. Who gets to go first? Thank you. I'm teasing. I'll introduce myself a little bit more when I start, but my name is Darielle Dannon, and among other things, I'm the lobbyist for Edom. So happy to be here today. I live in Minneapolis, so it wasn't too long of a journey.
Thank you, all of our commissioners here this evening. And EDM is the Economic Development Association of Minnesota. For those who are not familiar with the organization, it's our professional organization here for economic development. And my name is Holly Masick, and I am the Port Authority Administrator. Thank you all so much for being here. I really enjoy concurrent meetings. It's really great to bring both bodies together, because Sarah and I talk all day, but it's great to see all of you around the table.
And I'm Bob Erickson, President of the Port Authority. I'll just second what Holly said. I mean, I think these meetings are very useful, and especially since the Port Authority has taken on some additional things, and we need to work closely with the HRA on housing and issues and things. These meetings are really important.
I'm Tim Bussey. I'm mayor of the city of Bloomington, and I routinely thank our Port Authority members. I want to take the opportunity to thank our HRA members for the work that you put in. It's I mean, you could be doing anything on a Tuesday evening right now, and you're here, and I appreciate it. So thank you for your work, and looking forward to the conversation tonight.
I'm Cynthia Hunt from the Port Authority.
Sean Nelson with the Port Authority and a city council member.
Rob Lunds, Port Authority.
Jennifer Mueller, HRA.
And I'm Sarah Abe, HRA Administrator. Also very excited by the energy in the room tonight. Thank you, everyone.
Vicki Hukim, HRA.
Blake Doblinger, HRA.
Samoa, HRA and City Council.
Roderick Wooten, HRA.
Jenna Carter, HRA and City Council.
Samira Isa, HRA.
Okay, well, we have I guess we need to approve the agenda. We don't normally do that, but do you do that in the HRA, that you approve your agenda? So maybe you want to take action and approve your agenda?
All right, are there any edits or changes? Sorry. Are there any edits or changes to the agenda? Okay, hearing none, may I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Was it moved by Doblinger? Oh, sorry. Moved by Mua and second by Hukim. Any discussion? Oh, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, motion passes 7-0.
And then I think you also have approval of some minutes for the HRA. Yeah.
I believe we're going to do that at our HRA meeting.
And the organizational business, is that also something you'll do? Okay. So then we get down to new business. And I guess the new business is you.
Fabulous.
Welcome.
You read my mind. Super. All right. You can hear me? Fabulous. Well, again, Darielle Dannon. I had spent 7 years working at DEED as the government relations director and part of the leadership team. And I've spent my career, as probably many of you, working in that economic development and housing. Actually started my career in affordable housing. So as you're having this joint meeting, there's a lot of me that, in my personal opinion, and I think probably many of your opinions, economic development and housing are in some ways one and the same. Although, of course, they use some different tools in the toolbox to make them happen, but very, very related, very similar things. And of course, in that economic development space, if people don't have places to live, places that they can afford, how do you have workers? So I'm very excited to be here. Like I shared earlier, I am the lobbyist for EDM, and I kind of work in that economic development space. Now that and I will also say, as you were all introducing yourselves, having worked for the state, I continue to have a very special place in my heart for our local government and all the work that you do. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. We're going to see if the clicker, and the clicker is working. So feeling very good about that. So I'm going to start out by sort of doing some table setting about what's going on at the legislature, table setting, and then we'll get to kind of where we are. And right now we're at a great time to be doing a legislative update because we're at a legislative break. So you can't tell it by my dress, but we're on a little bit of a vacation right now, and that means that a lot of the bills are kind of in a really key position. It's going to set things up to the end of session. So it's a great time to sort of lay the table and then have a chat about where things are. And then, it's also a great time to think about if there's an opportunity to engage lawmakers to get things where you want them to be. So all that to be said, so table setting. The big work of this year is passing the biennial budget. And that's something that has to happen. I know there was an awful lot of back and forth at the beginning of session about sort of who was in control and all of that good stuff. No matter what's going on there, they have to pass a biennial budget. They also, last year, did not pass a bonding bill, which probably hits, I would assume you had some projects that you wanted, there we go, had some projects you wanted funded. So those projects, and my understanding is that they've been spending this last week really starting the work to think about what that bonding package could look like. Typically, those start with the package, kind of what was on the table for last year, and then go from there. So that's also work that they're doing right now. And then I have to put up here, but it should probably maybe have a question mark at the end, but potential federal budget impacts. And that's always something we're thinking about. But where the conversation has gone so far is that the state legislature is really likely to pass a budget without having enough information to know what those federal impacts could be. And so unfortunately, we've even said, depending on what might happen at the federal level, we could have to come back this summer in a special session and make adjustments. And I know that's not what anyone wants to hear, but just making sure you're sort of aware of that's where the conversation sits right now. And I already sort of alluded to this, but the legislative composition through the end of session has a tied House, which has never happened in my lifetime. And so that's already kind of setting up some interesting dynamics in the legislature. And right now the DFL has a 2-seat majority because, of course, they lost a Republican member, some weeks ago. And then the governor is back in town most of the time leading the state legislature. So I'm going to talk, I just have 2 slides about the fiscal outlook. And just as, I would assume folks have sort of seen it in the paper, but just to kind of set that table that we had about 4 years, and the last 2 years we had huge surpluses. You may have remembered it was $17 billion with a B. So we were able to do all kinds of exciting things, create new programs at the legislature. I will say I was at the state when that was happening, and on one hand, you're really excited about creating new programs and doing things you've always wanted to do. On the other hand, and you will see this as we go along, there's a lot of stuff that was funded one time or a one-time bump. And so now we're really struggling through the fact that, and you can see here, we have for the state, 456 million surplus is a tiny, tiny surplus for the state of Minnesota. We have a biennial budget that's around $72 billion with a B. So that is tiny at best, and for better or worse, often not a lot to, there's not a lot of space to do a lot of funding with. And that's just, there's been higher inflation, I think everyone knows. We also have, and this is what keeps getting in the paper, we've had a structural deficit at the state. And so that's something that you'll see at the House and Senate that they're proposing to fix. And what that means, and I mean, you all look at numbers all day, so I don't probably have to explain too much about what that means to you, but it just means that right now, because of sort of projections for the future, we're spending more money than we're getting in as a state. And so we have to do some structural fixes to at least make that an even thing. And then, do you like how I did not bold the $5.995 billion on the last bullet here, but that's what everyone's sort of looking out of the future going, we're concerned about that future. So you will see that the budgets are much, much more reserved as they're moving along. And then in terms of capital budget, and that's the budget for any bonding or any borrowing the state might do, that's also become much more restrained. And so it was 790 million. Right now they're projecting about 700 million. And you'll see when we talk in just a second about what targets are looking like. The House and Senate are actually having some very different ideas about how they might spend those dollars. And so this slide here, I'm going to pause on for a second. So one of the things the legislature does is so they get all that economic forecast, which is what I just talked through. And then the House and Senate separately, and the governor actually separately, decide how they may want to spend that. And how they do that is they set targets. These are targets for just key areas. It's not every single thing. But the target just says to the chairs of the committees, you can either spend this much over what's sort of in your base budget, kind of what your ongoing budget has in it, or, and the things that are in the little parentheses, you need to cut money from your base budget. And so you can see, unfortunately, that in the House in particular, they are projecting, oh, and that should say, sorry, it should say Senate, Senate, House, House. Sorry about that, team. But you can see that the House is has been directed to cut $50 million. So in the state, probably unlike you, and I separately sit on my neighborhood association, and sometimes it really messes with my mind because at the state we drop the last 3 zeros because we're usually dealing in really big numbers. And so these are all millions except for the bonding bill target in the Senate, which is $1 billion. So that's 1.35 billion. And so we drop those zeros. But so that means that the House is projecting for the next 4 years, they need to make base cuts. So they need to cut into projected funding people were hoping for the future of $50 million. And similarly, you can see those really significant cuts that the Senate is planning to make in the tax committee. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So I think this is all previewing. I said I was going to set the table, but the table is set to be a little bit, I would say, disappointing and restrained compared to the last 4 years. So that is all to be said. We'll talk through sort of where key bills are. Before I flip to the next slide, I'm going to preview to you that there's a couple key bills that are not out yet. One of those is the tax bill. And the tax bill does not have to follow the regular rules. Am I boring everyone? No. I feel like a few people are yawning, and I was like, I know I'm talking about a lot of money. If you have questions, you can also interrupt me. No questions? All right, okay. Come on, this is going to be really exciting, right? Yes, okay. So tax bill. So after this break, so the break is done. They're coming back at noon on Monday, so this next Monday. And we were expecting to see both a tax bill from the House and Senate, unfortunately, with these nasty-looking cuts in them. But we're going to see a tax bill come out, and then we will also see a bonding bill. The bonding bill is usually, if you've watched the legislature, the bonding bill typically likes to come out in a bad year in the last 4 hours of the legislative session. Hopefully in a good year, a little earlier than that. And I do know that legislative leaders are meeting right now. They've been meeting this week to kind of talk about what that might look like. But besides that, we do have most of our other key bills, except, and this isn't just me omitting something, the House Jobs Committee, so the Economic Development Committee in the House, they did not successfully get their work done. And so we also do not have their bill yet. So I'm going to put up just what's going on in the Senate version of that. And after the break, we will get the House's version. If you remember, see, they gave me a clicker. But if you remember, they have to make these really significant $50 million base cuts in the House. And so they're really struggling through that. They still should have gotten their work done, but they did not. So a few things to note in the Senate Jobs Omnibus Bill. So there's a number of key programs that I would guess you utilize here. I would guess the Port Authority has tapped into a few of these. Those probably the Minnesota Investment Fund, or MIF, Job Creation Fund, or JCF, and redevelopment grants. I know you've gotten some redevelopment grants. Yeah. So, and then I know that you do some small business work as well, and I would guess that the funding for the Small Business Assistance Partnerships Program helps fund some of the small business work that happens here as well, either by you directly, either by you directly or by community partners. So folks like Neighborhood Development Center, who you might recognize, the Latino Economic Development Center, and sort of other sort of trusted community partners. That's how they're funded to do that technical assistance, to work with entrepreneurs, to give them that like initial assistance. And then I just noted the Promise Act grant program here. That's run also by community partners, but is grant money to through nonprofits to small businesses to provide some grant funding up front. It was a new program that was created 2 years ago, and that's projected to continue on with some additional funding. Everything except for the last item here is just funded at base funding. So what that's going to feel like is particularly the redevelopment grants and the Small Business Assistance Partnership Program. And I made up that title. That's a terribly long title, and now every time I say it, I think to myself, really should have made up a much shorter name for that program. But anyway, those two programs are going to feel constrained because they're going to have about half as much funding in the base budget as they had the last 2 years. The other concern I have, and don't worry, the next slide's going to be talking about what's going on in the House, but the concern I do have about sort of where things are sitting is, again, some of this is going to feel like a constraint, and also I have some pretty good information that the Senate is probably going to be looking to make some additional cuts. And so I would say that even these levels of funding are potentially at risk. I'm guessing the Senate may cut into, and I think they're taunting me a little bit when they say this, and not in a good way, but maybe even eliminate funding for some of these programs to make their budget work. They're looking for $14 million that they accidentally spent from a place that they do not have money. So the House bill that is not listed on there. So the House, like I said, they're looking to make some serious cuts. I'm also expecting that the House is probably going to cut some of these core programs as well. And I always talk about these as these are our tools in our toolbox for economic development. So there are some concerns, and we at Eden, we just sent out a newsletter today and did a call to action for sort of all of our members. We've got over 550 members all over the state, folks who are working in that economic development space. We are suggesting this might be a good time to remind lawmakers about why these programs are important, and that we do need to make some space in the state budget to invest in them. And same, I'm very concerned about the House, and when we see that, they'll have some serious cuts too. Workforce development, I just wanted to note that essentially, same thing is happening in that workforce development space. So key programs are funded, but it's going to feel like a lot less. We had about $300 million of one-time funding that was put in the budget for the last biennial budget year. So this is base funding without really any changes, and there are a ton of direct appropriations, but they are sort of scattered all over the place. There's also a big fight going on between the Senate and the House, and if they're going to do those all together. So that's a place to kind of watch things here. I feel like I'm being a little long-winded, so I'm going to keep going. I did want to make a couple notes on the childcare space, because that's another place, just like housing, where if people don't have childcare, they can't go to work and they can't stay at work. And so there's a couple key investments that are made in that Senate jobs bill. We'll wait and see if they're in the House bill that are in the childcare space. And then there's some funding. Not a lot of funding, but there's a little bit of funding also. The House has a separate committee that provides some additional scholarship money, which is a pretty key component to that affordability, and that's in that bill. Now, the housing side of the room, you're not exactly divided up, but a little bit divided up. So I did not forget about housing, and like I said, housing is one of my first loves. But housing was a little bit more positive, and maybe this side of the room was feeling excited when you saw the targets, because the House at least got $75 million worth of target that they get to make, kind of invest in the housing space. The Senate unfortunately got $3 million. So you can see there's not a lot of additional money. The Senate funding that's listed here, that's base funding. But you can see that the challenge program, so that's the flexible development program for rental housing, that program got a big boost, a $10 million boost. The homeownership and workforce, so the second program, the first program, challenge program, is for rental housing. The second one is for homeownership housing. That got a little boost. FHPAP, which is around homelessness, that got a pretty good boost. Unfortunately, that's still going to feel like a cut of about $22 million because it got a lot of one-time money. But it is really positive that they're continuing to make investments and key investments in reducing homelessness. And then I listed out HIB bonds. So those are the housing infrastructure bonds. The House is accounting for the idea that they're going to do $100 million in bonding in their bill. The Senate's sort of figuring that out yet, and that's why there's a blank right there. There's a couple of other things that are kind of base funded, including rental assistance, There's some funding in the House bill for statewide tenant education. And at least right now, without seeing the tax bill, there's no change expected with some of the local affordable housing aid. I'm going to keep going. Bonding. And I've been alluding to it a little bit as we go along. I think the biggest problem is actually this last bullet here. And actually, if you've noticed a trend, the House and Senate on a lot of these targets and sort of how their bills are created are pretty far apart at this moment. The good news with that, even with bonding, the good news with that is that they're going to come back together again in the next few weeks, and they're going to renegotiate how they're going to spend. So if the Senate, for our housing friends, if the Senate is only going to spend $3 million additional dollars, and the House is going to spend $75 million, hopefully they will come to some sort of middle place. Maybe they'll go with the $75 million, but maybe they'll end up at $50 million or something like that. That's what sort of happens next. But they're doing that in the bonding space, really trying to figure out, kind of what are the size of our bills, because again, that Senate bill, or the target, the amount of money they're going to spend is about twice what the House's is. And I did have a little next step slides, which I was sort of alluding to here, but really the next steps are those bills, as they've walked through them, those bills are going to pass their respective floors, but then they're going to have to go back again and sort of negotiate. There are some huge gaps between those bills. So there's a nice opportunity to do some engagement, have some conversations with folks, elected officials, about kind of, making those investments, making sure we're making good strategic investments as they're thinking about targets and as they're kind of working through all the differences in the bill. You're okay. And then the House and Senate will pass compromise bills and the legislature adjourns May 19th. So it's a little over a month. I think in my head it was 6 weeks, but 5 or 6 weeks is what they have about left to go. Okay, now we just have a giant picture of my head. But I'm going to pause and see if we have questions. Hopefully I didn't bore everyone to death with that walkthrough of the legislature.
Questions? Anybody? I think it's just good to make a comment about the bonding bill. Probably most people are aware of that, but bonding bills are always more difficult because they require super-majorities. So you have to round up a lot more people to vote. It's not a simple majority vote. I think it's, 60%?
So it's 3/4.
Oh, it's 3/4.
Yeah.
Which is even, so that's one of the reasons that they take longer to put together.
Indeed. Yeah, some of the best chairs of that committee I've seen, they would invite folks, and sometimes I was working on significant projects, and they'd invite us all to sit down, and they literally had a spreadsheet with all the lawmakers, what they wanted, like what they needed in the bill to get their vote, and that's how they put the bill together. In my opinion, those were the best chairs. Not every, some chairs are a little bit more, I guess, flexible than that. But yes, that's absolutely true. And last year it was unfortunate, but they sort of were trying to shock and awe it through instead of get that nice spreadsheet, and so it did not have the votes and failed.
I think the other thing that we get into at the start of the session with the control of the House in question and these things, there was a lot of animosity between the groups. Have things kind of evened out? Are they working together, or is it still a lot of fighting going on?
That's a great question. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The first month of the legislative session, every time we would have this conversation, it was sort of all speculation. And if you recall, you may or may not recall that the DFL, because they didn't have agreement, the DFL would not go to St. Paul. And so it was real interesting for all of us. Who was in charge and who were chairs went back and forth quite a bit. I think they've improved. The animosity has improved, and some committees have done a very successful job getting, so in the House, it's a really unusual circumstance to get those omnibus bills agreed to at all. That means you have to have negotiated between the DFL and the Republican co-chairs first before they put out that omnibus bill, which is really unusual. That's usually something that happens once we get into May and we're doing actual negotiations. And so some of those committees, that's gone a little smoother than others. The housing committee, so for my housing friends, the housing committees seem to be getting along very well. Unfortunately, and you can sort of gather this, the Jobs Committee in the House has not put a bill out yet, so that has not gone particularly well. And that Children and Families Committee, which I'm tracking some things for in the child care space, they had a very bumpy week, but they did get their bill agreed to. So it's been a little, it really depends on the chairs. I do think that leadership chose most of those chairs based on, they tend to be folks who are not, you know, kind of on the far reaches of their party, but tend to be sort of collaborators in general. So while it's difficult, I do think, and in fact, the bigger picture, you know, I know there was a lot of speculation early in session if they would get done on time. And it does seem like things are moving along in an appropriate way to get done on time. Even with that one Jobs Committee bill done, I know way too much about what's going on with that, and it seems like there's just some small things that are still hanging them up. So I think they'll get done on time. And, you know, it's hard. It's always hard. People have a lot of strong feelings. Those negotiations are always difficult. And so maybe it's a good thing to do it with, you know, those joint chairs early. They've worked out some of the kinks early. And so maybe when we get to May, things will go a little smoother. Yeah, good question.
Mr. Mayor, did you have any?
I did have a question. I'm not as optimistic as you are about May 19th. I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And just wondering if you know anything, any of your federal counterparts, what their expectations are, because a right-sizing through Medicaid will blow a $200 million hole in the state budget, and then all bets are off.
I think $2 billion.
$2 billion, is that what it is? Yeah. I got my number wrong. I got my zeros wrong. See, the
No,
numbers
it's
mix
okay.
me up.
Well, I know, right?
Yeah.
The dropping of the 3 zeros really,
Yeah.
you can only imagine when I was because as being part of the leadership team and the government relations director for 7 years, I negotiated the budgets on like the jobs committee and stuff, right? And so I would leave that, and then I would go to my neighborhood association meeting where we would be talking about if we were going to contribute like $2,000 to a parade. And every time I'm looking down, I was like, how much is this, right? Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's going to be catastrophic if some of these things that are being proposed at the federal level pass. It's going to blow a hole in the state's budget. The reality is that the way the timing works, that federal budget is not happening until fall, right, with the federal fiscal year. And so the state legislature, we will go into state shutdown if we don't have a state budget done by the end of June. And so we have to do that. I know. And there's been a couple years where we've been negotiating, where, in fact, the last time that the Republicans had the Senate, many of us, including me, spent June and, June. We didn't go into state shutdown, but we came very close. And so I spent my entire June trapped in the Capitol negotiating, which was not the most fun thing. And so it will be really unfortunate if we end up in that same space with the federal budget. But the reality is, and I had the, I guess, unfortunate privilege of being in Health and Human Services the day that they had announced that even that federal funding for the Department of Health that has resulted in laying off, I think, between 150 and 200 folks, that was pulled back. And there was a long conversation, probably, a good hour and a half, about if the state could backfill that. And the reality is the state can't. We have to, by our state's constitution, we have to pass a balanced budget. We don't have the opportunity that for right or wrong, that the federal government does to do deficit spending. We can borrow, we can do bonding, so we can borrow. But yeah, it will blow a huge hole in the state budget. And while there's targets that do require, particularly on the Senate side, that require some pullback, they're cutting about a little over $200 million on the Senate target for Health and Human Services, which wasn't on your spreadsheet here. That's not finding $2 billion, is it? So yes, I don't know. I think we're all very, very concerned, and I don't know about all of you. I think every single day there's like a new thing or things that is happening at the federal level that we're trying to get our arms around. And I know for our housing friends, there's been some cancellations of some key housing funding, not here, but some cancellations on the federal level from some key housing funding, and I think there's a lot of worry. But yeah, excellent point. I like to come to things as just an optimist in general, but then I try to be like a really, also I'm an attorney, so part of me is like, and the worst case scenario could be. So I don't know, or maybe we try to hold both of those things in our heads and both be optimistic that we'll get a really reasonable state budget that makes good investments, and also sort of think ahead that, yeah, we could have to come back and do it all over again in the fall. Really these days, like everyone's so excited to hear from me. I'm full of good news. Go ahead.
Yep. Thank you. Do you have any updates with regards to policy in addition to the budget regarding economic development and housing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this year, there's not going to be a lot of policy. And in fact, typically we talk about this year is the budget year and next year is the policy year. The only policy that the leadership is allowing folks to include in bills is things that are non-controversial. So there's some really small stuff in the housing space that's not going to affect you so much, but there's some tweaks around the state housing tax credit that makes it slightly more flexible. There's been a lot of conversation. There's some sort of things that the agencies proposed, actually back to our federal funding. So there was a fund that I'm not tracking here that is called the Ford Fund. It was a big deal, very significant. And there are some policy changes in that fund to untether it from the federal money. So there's some kind of common sense components that are in the bills, but I would anticipate that next year is likely the year that we're going to do big policy. And actually, Edom, and we were sort of having side conversation about this, one of the things I think we're going to do this summer is have some conversation with practitioners, so folks on the ground who have ideas about, where our program's not working well, like what tools do we need in the toolbox that might be missing, and then are there tools that are like not serving us as well as they could be, and can we make some, suggestions next year to make some changes. So that's probably a little bit more what we're thinking of. But if there's any specific stuff that you're tracking, feel free to add that. And yes, there's some policy. Anything particular, Commissioner?
Yeah, I was just curious about the Yes to Housing efforts. Thanks.
Happy to talk about that briefly. So that proposal is not in the Senate housing bill at all. But the House amended their bill last week to change it from requirements for cities that would have required pretty much every city to overhaul or certainly take a very serious look at their current requirements for zoning and planning. And instead, what it does right now, and I will just say this language I would anticipate needs some work still. But what instead it does is it prioritizes and incentivizes cities that do comply with a list of items that they will get preferential treatment in scoring criteria. So, big picture, it seems to be maybe it's a little bit more similar to how we think about, the Met Council's housing programs as well, where they're more of a carrot than a stick. And so that's what they're thinking about. I would say right now, the language is still going to need some work, and our friends at Minnesota Housing at the moment are not super jazzed about that language. So I think there's still some work to be done, but so it's in a prioritization and encouragement space instead of the requirements that it was. Yeah, yeah. That I thought that you might be alluding to that, but I didn't want to assume.
Other questions, comments? Well, I think what your presentation tells us is that we may have to get together again when we know a little bit more about what's going on and have to be creative on how we can try to continue to move some of these things forward. So it's probably something that we may have to think about having a few more joint sessions when we know what the rules of the game are going to be and see what degrees of freedom we have. So thank you for your update. We appreciate it. And we hope you can take and maybe bring some good karma to the legislature, that everybody can start singing Kumbaya and do a bonding bill and all these other things, but that's probably not realistic.
Well, feel free to send your good energy towards the legislature to help make that happen.
All right. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So the next item then is the authorization to enter. Well, we're going to have a presentation. I know this item 5.2 is strictly an HRA vote. but we're going to have a presentation on it. All right, great. Welcome.
Thank you, President Chair. It is an HRA vote, but it's relevant information for the port since.
And I guess the port is contributing some money, but we won't be voting on it.
So this is the Opportunity Housing Ordinance Feasibility Study. And I'm going to go through a history of the Opportunity Housing Ordinance. I know I've spieled it several times to you all, but just to table set. And I'll go through reasons for this renewed study. I'll go through the scope of work and then talk about related actions that have been taken to date. And then we'll have that recommended action authorization from the HRA. So the Opportunity Housing Ordinance was initially established from a study that was conducted in 2018. And so that was a nexus study as well as an implementation study. And that implementation began in 2019 with a pilot phase. And it was it became fully into effect in September of that year. And so we've now been running with the OHO in place. And within that initial passage of the OHO, there was an intent that it would be a living document. So since that initial passage in 2019, we've come back and amended language and re-examined what incentives are offered to ensure that they're responsive to what we're seeing in the market. So at the bottom here, I've pulled out those main options for compliance with the OHO, which include building those units within the development. They can also build them off-site, and then they can pay the fee in lieu of providing those units. So just for a reminder, to build those units on-site, it's 9% of units at 60% AMI, and that per square foot in lieu fee is $9.60 per square foot of leasable market rate for an interior unit. So these are numbers that were established using that initial study, so they were informed by the findings of that study, and we've been implementing them since then, since 2019. So why do we have a need for a study? And then I'll also describe what a nexus study is, because that you'll see that interlaced throughout this presentation. So when we initially passed the OHO, there was an intent that, and a communication from staff, that there would be a comprehensive evaluation of that ordinance approximately every 5 years. And that was to ensure that the OHO would remain responsive to economic changes and housing needs. There's also within the OHO, there's purposes laid out in that ordinance language, and one of those purposes is that the OHO is implementing the goals of the city, the strategic guiding goals. And so some examples of that are the 2040 comp plan, city council strategic priorities like Bloomington Together Tomorrow. And so the OHO's intent is to implement those goals. So we need to ensure that as those goals change, the OHO is delivering on those goals. And then we also see the need for a study, including an opportunity for feedback from developers as well as housing stakeholders, which could include housing advocates, community groups within Bloomington and the Twin Cities region. And so this is an opportunity to get intentional feedback from them, which could include basically barriers that they've had with interacting with the OHO, or potentially the positive experience that they've had with the OHO. And I did want to highlight here that economic conditions have changed, and some things besides just external economic conditions, there are internal changes as well, such as the prevailing wage ordinance that the city passed recently. And so another consideration is the upcoming SAC and WAC fees that the city is looking to put into place. So both external and internal changes that impact what sort of developments are economically feasible to bring to Bloomington. So finally, what is a nexus study? A nexus study establishes, for a project that brings residential market rate units, what's the spin-off demand for affordable units from that development. So it's what's known as a proportional nexus. And it's important to have this in place because, as I mentioned, it informs the requirements within our ordinance. So that 9% at 60% AMI and that fee in lieu rate, those were direct results of that nexus study. So we're looking to not only conduct this study on the ordinance itself, but specifically renewing that nexus study with the current market conditions. So I mentioned changing market, and this is just a preview because Durley and I are going to get into this in the following presentation. But you can, it's very visible within these graphs that things have changed very quickly recently. And so we're still seeing that impact in the market. So yeah, that's a preview. So what's included in this study, we're looking to, I mentioned, get that feedback from stakeholders on what's working and what isn't, what changes are needed and what are they seeing in the market. Because for obvious reasons, those developers are the ones that have the most vision into how the economic conditions are impacting their developments. So we're looking to receive that feedback. We're also looking to get that deep dive into data. So beyond the Nexus study, there will also be a financial feasibility analysis, which will include building out models, financial feasibility models for different typologies of housing. So think different unit counts, different like bedroom types, so different orientations of housing. What is the feasibility, the financial feasibility of those different products as they interact with the OHO? And then finally, the study will have a final report as well as an implementation roadmap, which is very important. That was a component of the initial study, and it instructed how the staff actually put those findings into place and implement them. So related actions that have been taken to date: back in April of last year, so a whole year ago, the HRA authorized staff to begin an application to the Livable Communities Act Policy Development Program. So this is a Metropolitan Council program through their LCA, the LCA grants programs. And what that allows is for funding to change policy to allow and remove barriers for affordable housing. So that application was authorized in April, and we were happy to receive that funding in June to get $45,000. It was actually a competitive application cycle, which hadn't been the case previously, but we still came out as the highest funded applicant for that round. So since then, we've been working to get our RFP in order, which has taken longer since we've been responding to rapidly changing market conditions. But we had that RFP window open between February and March. We did get responses and held respondent interviews earlier this month and had a final scoring. That evaluation team that scored those respondents included staff from the Port, the HRA, and the planning division. And I think that's important because it's reflecting some of the stakeholder groups that are very important at the city level. So we have involvement from all three, the Port, HRA, and the Planning Commission on the implementation of the OHO. So we had staff reflecting that view internally. And we've had a selection made from that RFP process. So tonight we're considering the authorization to enter into a contract with that respondent. And that respondent is Daedalus in a partnership with BAE. And those you may recall are the original study consultants. So they conducted that initial study back in 2018. They actually conducted it in separate contracts, so they weren't working in tandem. So we were excited to see them apply as a team this time, and they're bringing their expertise to each component of the study, of the scope of work. So why were they selected through the evaluation process? Their RFP response was very comprehensive. They hit on all of the scope items in great detail. They identified which data sources they plan on using for this study, which we appreciated as to understand exactly what they'll be looking at in what geographic area. They also will give staff access, but basically staff will be able to keep those financial models that will be built, which we think is important as economic conditions continue to change. We may be able to use those models to at least bring that information to developers and boards and commissions. And then finally, of course, there was a high scoring for that experience in conducting the initial study. So the proposed action tonight would be to authorize the HRA as the administering entity to enter into a contract with Daedalus Advisory Services. And then that project would be funded first with the HRA's policy development grant, that $45,000, and then that remaining cost would be split between the HRA and the Port Authority. That full contract amount is included in the agenda packet. It's $104,000 and some change. So the final report and the implementation roadmap is slated to be delivered in November of this year. And so they'll be looking, Daedalus would be looking to kick the study off next month in May. And so there's your recommended motion, and I will stand for questions.
Any Port Authority questions? Turn it over to the HRA.
Commissioner Carter?
Thank you, Chair. So, so my understanding is that the analysis will be based on current market conditions, but I mean, we just got done with a presentation that shows how uncertain and crazy things are right now. And so I guess I'm just curious if you or if the consultants are here on the phone, like how does that factor into the study and the results?
President, Chair, Commissioner Carter, we did actually put that question to, so when we did our interviews with the candidates, we put that question to them of can they do analysis on different, basically different economic forecasts. So potentially like a worst case, business as usual, best case. And they highlighted that because they'll be giving us access to those models, there will be a bit of a flexibility for us to basically respond to continued changes. And then they were very clear that their analysis will look at all of these moving components. So I think construction input costs are probably something we'll want to really focus on as a result of tariffs that could that could impact your construction materials like steel. We already know is absolutely getting a tariff. I can't remember the percentage, but so we did hear from Daedalus that would be a component of their study.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Other questions, comments? Commissioner Mua?
Thank you, Chair. I think this comes at a really good time. In my particular industry, we work very closely with a lot of different organizations, and I've noticed over the last year and a half that the construction industry is pulling back pretty significantly. So I'm looking forward to seeing the results from the study. But I'm also interested in what staff will take and bring back to these bodies once we have that. Do you have an idea of how we're going to use that information?
President, Chair, Commissioner Moa, thank you for that question. I should have highlighted like some of the takeaways that we expect could come include adjustments to the ordinance specifically related to the incentives that are offered. So if we hear back from, for example, the developer outreach that certain incentives aren't working, or if we hear that certain incentives are very important, then there may be an opportunity to adjust those to basically be respondent. And then I do anticipate results informing potential changes to the requirement, the OHO requirement. So it's that 9% at 60% AMI currently, but one consideration is being responsive to the city's goals. And so I've reported up here a few times that we've actually achieved our Met Council housing need allocation for 60% AMI housing. So does that mean that we need to adjust our OHO requirements to be more directed at the 50% and 30% AMI levels? That's something that we expect this study could inform a recommendation from staff. So those are some of the things that I could see, changes to the incentives as well as requirements.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments?
I'm just going to ask Holly, I assume, Holly, that this is included in the Port Authority budget, the money we're talking about? Thank you.
Come out of your paper.
All right, so let's proceed with, I'm sorry. Okay. Let's proceed with the motion to authorize the HRA administrator to enter into a professional services agreement with Daedalus Advisory Services in the name of the Housing and Redevelopment Authority in and for the city of Bloomington. So motion?
So moved.
Moved by Hukim and second by Wooten. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes 7-0.
Great. So we're on to the next item then, which is the annual housing report.
Okay, good evening.
Apologies. Yeah, thank you, President, Chair. Yeah, so our next item, is the All Things Housing report. So we're actually giving a presentation previewing those report findings, and we expect that report to come out in the next few weeks here. So last year, you'll recall, Michelle Lincoln and I presented these findings, and so Durley has taken on the data side of this report, and hopefully had a good time with that. I know Michelle had a very comprehensive deep dive into data each year with this report. So we're excited to keep it moving. And one reminder is that this is what we're calling like an interim year for this report because it's responsive to American Community Surveys data, ACS data, which they move on basically a 5-year timeline. And then at the 3-year and 1-year mark, they have smaller data releases, and those estimates have smaller sample sizes. And so we consider the 5-year data releases to be banner years. And so 2026 will be the next banner year because that'll be the next window for ACS 5-year data. So this is basically a smaller change that we'll see reflected in the data this year. So with that, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. Good evening, everybody. So today we are going to review Bloomington's demographic, existing housing, affordability, and some accomplishments of 2024 year. It's important to review these trends because it guides city services, policies, and programs development to ensure that Bloomington remains a thriving and inclusive community. We're going to start with Bloomington demographics. So Bloomington has a total population of 91,537 people with an average household size of 2.27 person and 39,634 households. It is the Minnesota's 4th largest city, and the population continues to grow. We are anticipating to have over 95,000 residents by 2040. The median age in Bloomington is 40.8 years, which is higher than both the Minneapolis and St. Paul metro area and the Minnesota state. And as a fun fact, the median age in 1970 was 23 years old. Yeah. This data suggests that Bloomington has an aging population, and understanding population growth help us anticipate with housing, education, workforce, and services need within the city of Bloomington. Bloomington continues to become more racial and ethnically diverse. Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC, represent the 33% of population, and 67% is represented by white alone people.
It was interesting at the State of the Schools presentation today. They said that 60% of the school population, so the younger population, is more diverse than the older or the total population.
Yeah, that's interesting. So increasing racial and ethnic diversity in Bloomington brings several factors or benefits, which cultural enrichment, economic growth, improve public services, and strong community connections. For employment, residents work in different industries, but just 6 industries employ over 75% of Bloomington employees, and the top industries as reported by the U.S. Census are educational services, healthcare, social assistance. Second, professional, scientific, and management, administrative, and waste management. The third is arts, entertainment, recreation, and accommodations and food services. That means hotels. 4, manufacturing. The 5th is transportation, warehousing, and utilities. And the last one is retail trade. For unemployment, I know this might be a little bit hard to see, but Bloomington is represented in the blue, the first line. So Bloomington's unemployment rate was improved greatly since 2020. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the unemployment rate was 7.6, which was higher than the county and the regional rates. And we believe that it was mainly due to the job losses in the retail and accommodation and food services sector. However, the city's job market has recovered well, and the unemployment has dropped to 3% in 2024. Starting in 2010, Bloomington's median income was approximately $55,000 $59,458, which is lower than the both Hennepin County at $61,328 and the metro area at $65,181. Just so, I don't know if it's really hard to see, but Bloomington is represented in the orange, Hennepin County is the blue, and the metro area, it's the yellow. Fast forward to 2020, we see a significant growth across the board. Bloomington rose to $78,224, and Hennepin County and metro area hit over $80,000. In 2021, Bloomington continued to improve with a median income of $80,582, but it is still behind Hennepin County and the metro area. By 2023, Bloomington's median income has reached $90,677. However, it's important to note that it still remains lower than both the Hennepin County at $96,339 and the metro area at $98,180. We see, on this slide, we see a breakdown of housing in Bloomington on the left side of the screen. 63% of homes are owner-occupied, while 33% are renter-occupied, and only 4% of the housing units are vacant. The median home value is $346,200, which is slightly higher than the metro area and the state. And on the right side of the screen, we see Bloomington housing transactions. So most sales were single-family homes with a median price of $387,500, and townhouses and condos follow with a lower median prices. Two-family homes had the highest median price, but they made up only a small number of sales. And overall, this gives us a snapshot of a larger owner-occupied city with a steady housing values, and suggests that we need to continue addressing housing demand challenges. So for renting, Bloomington's median gross rent is $1,526, which is higher than both Metro and Minnesota. Over time, the rent has increased in Bloomington, starting from just over $1,300 in the 1990 census to where we are now. Looking at the lower chart, the rent increases with the number of bedrooms, with Bloomington consistently showing higher rental rates across all unit sizes, from studios to 5+ bedroom homes, compared to both Metro and the state average. This trend suggests that Bloomington has a higher demand for rental housing, and is possibly due to location, amenities, age, or the local market conditions. For housing disparities, this chart shows clear difference in who rents and who owns a home in Bloomington based on race and ethnicity. The blue represents the owner-occupied housing units, and the yellow represents the renter-occupied housing units. White households are more likely to own their homes, but the non-white households renting is much more common. The biggest gap is with the Black or African American households, with which more than 74% are renters. And there is a big difference compared to the white households. Other groups like Hispanic, Asian, and multiracial residents also have a higher renter rates. And this difference represents the ongoing impacts of historic inequities, such as discriminatory lending practices, redlining, and economic inequalities. It shows that we still have work to do to make housing fair and accessible to everyone in the community. On the right, so on the right, the pie chart is just showing the housing distribution by unit type. The largest portion is single family with 51% of the total housing units, and the second is multifamily with 39.9% of housing units. Multifamily is included with is greater than 3 units. So Bloomington has a total of 42,705 taxable housing units, and on the left side, this chart shows that the city housing stock spans a wide range of construction periods, but significant share was built between 1950 and 1959, that followed by 20.4% from the 1970s and 18.5% from the 1960s. Homes built from 20,000 and onward accounts for just about 10% of the total housing units. This shows that a market dominated by older homes with limited construction in recent years. So city programs like the home improvement loans help residents to keep them safe, livable, and up to date, supporting housing stability, improvement, and maintaining the characters of Bloomington neighborhoods. In 2025, the Planning Division led a homeowner association study to assess the distribution of homeowners associations in Bloomington. The study identified that there are 5,681 units, which make up over 13% of the total taxable housing units in Bloomington. Most HOAs are tied to townhomes and condos, mainly in the west and south part of the cities. Condos are often in high-density areas or near a major road, and townhomes are more spread out in suburban-style areas. The assessing department usually doesn't track single-family homes, but during this study, we did find a few single-family homes with an HOA. So this study will help with future housing and planning decisions. Some other data that we found during this study was the median year bill was 1982. The average monthly fee was $520, but it ranges anywhere from $300 to $1,000 plus, and it just depends on the size, the services, the physical assets, and amenities. Many HOAs hire professional management companies, but smaller complexes or smaller HOAs are often self-managed. We did find that most of the HOAs are registered as domestic nonprofit corporations, and 19 buildings offered structure or underground parking. So for housing affordability, this is an example. So this data highlights a significant gap in housing affordability. Over 52% of homes in Bloomington are valued between $300,000 and $499,000. However, a household earning $97,800, which is 80% AMI, can only afford a home price around $290,000 and $300, which it means that most of the available housing is already out of reach for many moderate income families. And I know that Kenny is going to explain a little bit about what the AMI and how that, what the AMI is and how that works. For housing cost burden, households consider cost burden when they spend 30% or more of their income on housing. For renters, this includes rents and utility, and for homeowners, it includes mortgage, taxes, insurance, and utilities. Over time, more people in Bloomington are feeling this burden. Back in 1990, about 22% of all households were cost burden, and that number has grown to 29% today. Homeowners have seen a smaller increase from 15 to 20%, but renters are much more affected, which are nearly 49% cost burden. And this shows that affordable housing is becoming a bigger challenger, especially for renters.
Thank you. So yeah, we mentioned AMI. I've probably said AMI up here 100 times already. So we thought that this would be a great time to define what that actually is and talk about how that gets established. So the Housing and Urban Development Department of the federal government calculates annually the metro fair market, or the fair market rent area, and that's calculated for the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Bloomington, Minnesota, Wisconsin, HUD metro, and that's the 13 county metro, which is different than the 15 county metro, and it's also different than the 7 county metro, but that's what HUD uses. It's the 13 county metro. So they get data from American Community Surveys, the ACS data that I mentioned. They choose the most recent and reliable census data, so there's a test for what's considered reliable, and once they've selected that, they're looking at median income for specifically a family of 4. So they'll take that number and apply an inflation factor depending on what year is being calculated, and then they'll round to the nearest 100, and that's how we get our AMI levels. So when HUD publishes this information, they do it for the 30%, 50%, 80%, and 100% AMI levels. The Metropolitan Council then takes that 50% AMI level and applies what they call the assumed annual income calculation. So they're taking, maybe I can use this laser. They're taking the 50% AMI level and they're applying these ratios, and the ratios are established on a 1.5 person per bedroom test. So I included here the calculation for specifically a 2-bed, so 3 people, and they're applying that ratio to the affordability level. This table has the levels for a 4-person household, but HUD also publishes 1 through 8, so persons per household. So they apply this this ratio to those numbers, and that's how they get the monthly income level. They publish it as, that's how they get the AMI levels for different bedroom sizes. So once they have that number established, they apply the affordable level, which for rent, which is that the rent plus utilities does not exceed 30% of your monthly income. So once you do all those steps, then you're left with what affordable rent levels are considered. And that's what we use for our programs. So specifically the Opportunity Housing Ordinance, those 9% of units at 60% AMI, this is where we're getting those numbers that we're sending out to property managers and making sure that they have those in their lease agreements and that their renters are paying those numbers. So I wanted to show how those numbers play out with different data points within Bloomington specifically. So here I have the Bloomington median rent, and so this is across the board, all household sizes. This is reported in census data. So please keep that in mind when you see the other levels, which the other levels are relevant for specific household sizes. So this is across the board. This is the median rent within Bloomington. So now I'm comparing this to what is considered that affordable housing cost. So we established that's 30% of your monthly income. That's what's considered affordable. So based off of median income, what would be the affordable rent level in Bloomington? And you're seeing that that's actually quite a bit higher. So this is for a household that's earning 100% of the area median income, which you saw back in 2024, that was in excess of $100,000. So this is what those households can afford. And it's actually higher than median rent in Bloomington. So this next line is what we have from HUD. So this is, I was showing you that 2-bed level, which is based off of the whole metropolitan area. So this isn't specific to Bloomington. When HUD gives us these numbers, it's for that statistical area, but we're applying those levels at the Bloomington geographic area. So you can see for a 2-bed, that affordable level for an 100% AMI household is actually above Bloomington's median rent. And I wanted to call out what I think is an important inversion here. Oh, so next slide. So that I've circled it here. Between 2020 and 2021, we actually saw that 2-bed rent level go above what's affordable for a household earning median income. So, for example, so this is our assumed annual income is for a 3-person household. We're now saying that the median income earning household in Bloomington isn't making enough to rent that 2-bed household. So then the next line that I'm bringing in is the 2-bed rent level for 60% AMI. So that's what we're restricting our OHO units at. And this is another important inversion, which is that affordable rent level for 60% AMI is now higher than what Bloomington's median rent is. And so what this implies is that a housing development bringing units into Bloomington, it might not actually be that financially straining to bring those units in, because we're seeing that median rent is actually lower than that affordable level. So of course this is units across the spectrum, and as Durley showed, we have a lot of old units within Bloomington. So please keep that in mind, but I do think that these are very important inversion points, and they're the result of a lot of factors. So, and I will highlight a couple of those cost factors that I'd previewed earlier. But moving on from there, I did want to go through some HRA program accomplishments. We report on these in the All Things Housing report. So in the interest of time, I'll zip through these, but the HRA administers the tenant-based voucher program, and you can see across the board, we've got households that are utilizing this program. We did see one move turnover for the assisted rental program in the HRA, but overall, the HCV levels don't change significantly year over year. But one thing that we probably should highlight is the Bring It Home rental assistance program that the state is opening their RFP for right now. We were just talking today about that application process. So that may be coming up, and it may be an opportunity for Bloomington to have additional vouchers come into our administration, and that those would stay specifically in Bloomington. So other accomplishments, there's actually a very, very significant increase in the Journey to Homeownership program. So last year, I think it was around 300, so it's almost, from 300 to 500, a huge increase in the utilization of that program. And so that program helps household readiness for a home purchase. So there's a lot of interest in getting into homeownership currently, but what you'll see later is maybe not a lot of people succeeding in getting into homeownership. Our HCV waitlist, this was a huge accomplishment in 2024, which is that a policy revision was made to have that waitlist be open all year, 100% of the time. And initially, approximately 6,500 households entered into the waitlist. And just recently, we've had the first deadline for households to save their spot. So if they don't renew their registration on that list, they get kicked off the list. They do have that opportunity to get back on the list and re-register. And we did see from 6,500 down to approximately 3,900 at that first Save My Spot deadline. And then we also wanted to call out in 2024 a huge investment into upgrading and maintaining our HRA-owned properties. So those are properties within the rental assistance program and the preparing for homeownership. I'm blanking on the actual name, but those two programs. So finally, I wanted to call out here, we have our rehab loan as well as our help loan. And we saw in 2024 a continued trend of more loan approvals and fewer loan repayments. And I would say that trend is likely influenced by people wanting to stay put in a high interest environment. We're still seeing mortgage rates at historical highs. And so these loans specifically are at 2% simple interest. So you can imagine there's not a lot of urgency to repay those loans currently, although I did hear recently that we just had a flurry of repayments in 2025. So those aren't part of this data because this is just 2024 data. So we've continued to see that trend of more people seeking those loans. Durley mentioned that our older units are needing that maintenance. So this is one of the opportunities that Bloomington households have to get money for those rehab projects. So finally, new development. This is familiar data in a different format, but so we did have some projects open in 2023. One was 100% affordable, And then under construction are another 3 substantial projects. So just seeing them mapped out here, here's the projects that completed in 2024. So Oxborough Heights was that 100% affordable building. And then over on the east side, we had Ardor on the Bluffs. That's a 100% market rate building. And then Noble Apartments has 9% of its units at the 50% AMI level because they did receive TIF assistance. And then in the pipeline, there's the 3 units in the west that are currently under construction, and that includes, I'll highlight 700 American. That's a project that it's called the Rosalind now, I should be clear. And that's a project that got a lot of assistance from the HRA in the form of an Affordable Housing Trust Fund loan, as well as project-based vouchers for those 30% AMI units. And we only have one project now that has development entitlement, and that's phase 5 at Bloomington Central Station. And so I think that's important to illustrate what we've been talking about of decreased construction and interest in building. And here's why that might be the case. This is a producer price index specifically for construction materials, and we see that huge spike. And there was since then, it hasn't continued to increase, but it also hasn't decreased. It's held at that level. Whereas if you look back at the recession, they had a spike, but then it fell back down. So we're seeing that increased index for construction materials stay high. If it does stay level for a few more years, then I think we'd reach that point where we'd be at the point where we would be if the trend line had continued. But we're still in that market shock phase where developers, they're just not seeing their usual projects pencil out anymore. And so I mentioned interest rates have remained high. We're still in a high interest rate environment. And so that's impacting financing for projects. So a project that would have come to the city is now seeing, I forgot my notes on what that changes, but there's, I believe it was like 5% increase to their overall costs just from financing alone. Yeah. So that comes through their lending, and those are just costs that the city can't, there's no assistance that we can provide in that case.
And I know that was a lot of information. So here are a few takeaways. So Bloomington population is older than the metro and the state. The city is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. Bloomington has consistently the income has consistently increased, but is still behind the regional and the county averages. The income levels are closely with the metro area, but disparities exist in homeownership by race and ethnicity. Also, a growing number of households in Bloomington are spending more than 30% of the income on housing, especially renters. And a few of your takeaways?
Yeah, I think I got to a lot of the takeaways at the end of my presentation, but highlighting that we're still in an environment where costs are high, financing is expensive for these projects, and Bloomington isn't alone in seeing that decrease of construction starts and projects seeking entitlement to begin construction. So you've probably seen a lot of news articles about St. Paul and Minneapolis that have shown that line is going down and staying down. So I think the takeaway is that it's a very challenging environment, and we as staff are hearing a lot of requests from developers to help them make their projects work. But they're not the only ones that are strapped for resources. We're also strapped for resources, and we heard that at the state level too. So thank you, and we'll stand for questions.
You got a question?
Yeah, I do. I'm looking at cost-benefit challenges. What role do you think an increase in property taxes as well as increase in insurance is having an effect, short-term and long-term, on AMI as well as on the ability to build at an affordable rate?
President, Chair, Commissioner Wooten, I will try and scrub back to, there's a slide, it's probably, I'm not going to be able to get to it. A slide that we had that showed what's considered an affordable home price at those different AMI levels. And so that's another number that the Metropolitan Council prepares for us, prepares for the Metro. Oh yeah, that one. So that takes into account interest rates. It does take into account insurance costs, but this number isn't frequently updated. So I think you've highlighted something really important, which is that those costs are increasing. And so what that means is this affordable home price level even if incomes increase, that affordable home price level may stay at the same because it is taking into account those costs that the homeowner will have to pay after making their home purchase. So, yeah, I think that's a really excellent point to make, and it just means that purchasing a home doesn't become affordable.
Other questions? I have a comment. I get a little excited when people say interest rates are historically high. No, they're not. Okay, they're not. 18, 19%, that was in the 70s and the 80s. Yeah, that's historically high. Interest rates were artificially kept low during COVID. So I think what we're finding is a more balanced market, in that 6 to 7% is more of a normal market. I mean, we'd like to see them get 6, closer to 6 than 7, but it's not. And I think just everyone, households, people, businesses have to adjust to kind of the new norm of this is what interest rates are, and this is what you figure them out in projects. And yeah, it's going to hurt, but it's also, we're getting to a balance kind of where interest rates should be. So I'll get off my soapbox now.
Well, I'll just reinforce your comment. When we bought our first house in 1973, it was a 7.75% rate, and we thought that was pretty good. So again, they've been normal, but one of the things that I was excited about hearing, and maybe the mayor or somebody else wants to comment on it, is to solve the affordable housing issues and things, it takes a number of approaches to it. And the city has recently been looking at making some changes to ordinances and things that might permit us to go back to what was done for many years, where somebody takes in a boarder or somebody just rents a room out or does something else, and it's something that can help elderly people stay in their home, and maybe they have some companionship and something. And so I think that there are other things that we're looking at, and if we continue in this environment with the construction costs and interest rates being high, and I think the chance of interest rates going down to the 2 and 3% level is probably not very high. So we're going to have to look at how we can think creatively about this, and I think that's probably going to be some of the most important problem solving that we do.
I would agree, Mr. President, and I give staff credit as within the city, both HRA staff, the port staff, and just our planning staff keep bringing back ideas and suggestions and opportunities and ideas. I like the single room occupancy proposal. I think is one of the more interesting and creative ideas, especially given the possibility of our old office buildings being converted into SROs. There are real possibilities there, and we just need to keep considering things like that. As President Erickson said, the older thinking of taking in a boarder or these single room occupancy, which were popular until they weren't anymore and were outlawed for a variety of reasons back in the 70s, I think have a real possibility.
You've got a question?
Chair.
Commissioner Mua?
Thank you, Chair. Just a comment, more than anything. I found it very interesting to see that our median incomes were pacing with the metro and the state, and then to see that our home prices are higher than everyone else. And so it makes me think, okay, if our population is aging, are we having the jobs in place that help them transition out of the workforce and allow younger folks with families to transition into the workforce? But then it's really about how can we do, and I'm excited about why we have this joint meeting, is how can we continue to improve the economic prosperity in Bloomington so that when people can come here, they can live here. Because eventually, I think we're in the middle of this, there's going to be a transition. As we get older, eventually it's going to transition, and we're going to have to attract young families to Bloomington. And there is no doubt in anyone's mind that I am very passionate about young families because that's the stage of life that I am in. And I want to see this city continue to prosper, but that means that young families have to have a reason to stay here, and jobs is a big piece of it. So I'm excited for the partnership that we're going to continue to have. But I also know that the challenges that we're going to have to face and the realities of our situation here in Bloomington are enormous. And so it's going to take the collective effort of everybody here to make sure that we can continue to make sure that jobs are here and people can live here.
Commissioner Hugi.
Thank you, Chair. To kind of to piggyback off of what Commissioner Mua was saying is, I think, you know, when we think about creativity, we have to think outside of just, you know, I will do my soapbox of like tiny homes and things like that. Like, they're a lot more popular in other states. I work in due diligence, alt investments in particular, and we see a lot of these developments really starting to come and a lot of hype into them. And I think that, you know, it's something that we need to, I think, dig a little deeper into and really open our minds and be creative to the fact that people not everybody wants to live in a big house anymore. Not everybody wants to live in an apartment. Some people just want to cohabitat, but individually. And there's ways around that. I think we're seeing younger generations wanting different things. They want transit. They don't want cars. They want walkability. They want these things, and we have to continue to provide those things in order to bring in young families and bring in the future. So that's kind of, I guess, my little soapbox on that.
Thank you.
Port Authority, questions, comments? You know, one of the things that I think about in Bloomington, of course, is in the fortunate situation that it has over 30% of its surface area in parks. And what that lets you do is, because you have recreational areas and things adjacent, you can take higher density. And so I think we're in a situation where a lot of these things can be perhaps looked at. And there's a lot of work on a national basis. An international basis. I just was reading an article in The Economist about the British housing market, and they are concluding that some of the rigid zoning requirements and other things that they put in following World War II didn't help. In fact, they took and stymied the whole process. And so I think we may have to be in a situation where we look at some of these things and say, okay, why did we do this? And did it work? Didn't it work? And go. But we do have a situation where we have a lot of people that find it very difficult to find affordable housing. And that's part of the reason that we have the homeless that we have and dealing with it. So it's something that I think we're going to have to be creative about looking at. And given the financial situation we're likely to be in, it's going to take really a lot of thought and effort. So we have some real challenges ahead of us, I think, to see what we can do to ameliorate this issue. If we don't have anything else, I think the Port Authority can adjourn, and I understand the HRA is going to continue on. So we will leave you.
We'll be having a 5-minute break for the HRA.
Thank you all.